a horrible sound. He tears the spinning high-tension cables down. The people on board the subway train will scream to God as he walks in at them. He picks up a buzzer and then he throws it back down as he wades through the village to the center of town. Oh, they say he's got to go Godzilla. Oh, there goes Tokyo, Godzilla. History shows again and again how nature points up the follies of men. History shows again and again how nature points up the follies of men. Godzilla, a bit of blue oyster cult for you there, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Annie Roberts.
Everybody clapping now, you've heard what I'm saying. Might be rubbish. Right, good evening. Thanks very much for coming to listen to my talk, which is about the alleged Berwyn Mountain UFO crash, delivered in my best Yorkshire accent. I apologise for largely reading from my notes, but it's a complex case and I want to make sure all the facts are got across to you. I don't know how many of you have actually heard of the Berwyn Mountain UFO case, but if you haven't, you should all have read this, which was left on your seats earlier. This is the case as you would read about it if you read it in a newspaper or on the internet or in one of the more, shall we say, trashy UFO books that abound. That's a composite account of the Berwyn Mountain myth, if you like. If you've got prior knowledge of the Berwyn case or have read this, then you've got a good grasp of how the media and most ufologists view the event. If not, you should still be able to follow this talk fairly easily, I think. You also need to know, because I throw it on the floor for dramatic effect, that I've got a book out about the case, which is available in the foyer there. This book is a complete overview of the case and its mysteries, and it's fairly essential reading, whether you're a sceptic or a believer. And by buying it, you're also supporting the CFZ, as it's them who've kindly published it. In this lecture, I'm hopefully going to show you how the legend came about. It's not a debunking exercise. I'm not trying to just trash the case for the sake of doing so. I'm trying to point out how UFO cases come about. And if you read about the case and the internet and in books, you'll find there's many bizarre claims made about it. For instance, that it was a UFO shot down by ships in the North Sea or the Irish Sea, or that jets were sent to intercept a UFO. These things are unsubstantiated, and I'm only dealing with the facts of the case to try and get to the bottom of it. Next slide, David, please. It's been called the Welsh Roswell, and in fact that's pretty much what it is. It's an investigation with a twist. Initially I believed that I had solved every aspect of the Berwyn Mountain case, but new information came to light a couple of years ago that indicates that in and amongst the twists and turns of the case there is at least one genuine mystery, which as yet remains unresolved. So, whether you're a total sceptic or a believer, there should be something in this talk to keep you entertained. The Berwyn Mountain UFO event, which took place on the 23rd of January 1974, wasn't initially a UFO case at all. In fact, it wasn't a UFO case until ufologists, people who study UFOs, turned it into one. So the way I'm approaching this talk is to talk you through the Berwyn Mountain case step by step. Before I try and unravel the case for you, I'd like to start with a quote from Edward Curtis, the famous ethnographer, who, after writing a 20-volume history of the North American Indians, concluded, next slide David please, I am beginning to believe that nothing is quite so certain as facts, and I think anyone who's done any investigation of paranormal or strange phenomena will find that to be true. And you might wish to bear this in mind when either reading my book or when weighing up the various witness accounts of this or any other account of anomalous phenomena. We must also remember that whatever happened in the Berwyn Mountains took place 36 years ago now. Although I and other people have interviewed several of the principal witnesses, telling the story of the past requires the researcher to assemble as much information as is available to make a judgment as to what really happened. And as such, the best historians and researchers can do to combat the corrosive effects of time on people's recollections is to emphasise those accounts that were recorded as close to the event as possible. That said, it's unwise to dismiss out of hand any account merely because it was collected well after the event, as that would be to ignore valuable testimony that has the potential to reveal vital information and unrecorded facts. But people are strange, very strange, probably stranger than anything the people themselves investigate. And they can easily confuse facts, times, chronologies, etc., especially when they have been exposed to other versions of events they were involved in. The best we can do is to look for supporting evidence for people's claims and to weigh them against other accounts. And I'm a great believer in what I call the paper trail. And by that I mean that events leave a trail of paper, both official and unofficial, and if these can be collated and analysed and matched with witnesses and other interviews, it's usually possible to come up with an approximation of what really took place. The Berwyn events are confusing, and I'll be whisking through them at speed. If you don't understand anything or wish to discuss any aspect of it in greater detail, I'm around after the talk and for most of tomorrow, so please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, let's start to unravel the case. Firstly, where geographically are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the Berwyn Mountain area of North Wales, which is, David? You can see there if this pointing device works. Basically, we're talking about that area there, with Llandrithlo being the centre. You'll hear the name of the village Llandrithlo mentioned quite a few times in this talk. If you put the next slide on, David, you can see that's where we are exactly. That's the town of Bala, which is quite well known. Llyn Tegid there. Llandafell and Llandrithlo are the two towns which feature mostly in the case, and that area of land there is the Berwyn Mountains themselves, with the peaks there. Some ufologists believe that the military were aware that a UFO was going to crash or land in the mountains before it even took place. This notion came about because in the year prior to the Berwyn events, 1973, there had been a wave of mystery helicopter sightings seen across the north of England, the Pennine Moorlands and neighbouring mill towns. And they seemed to be the focus of these phantom helicopters as the press dubbed them. Phantom flyers were seen several times in late January 1974 over Cheshire and Staffordshire, near the border between England and Wales. And those who saw them said they seemed to be looking for something. And it's this that ufologists have turned into the military searching for the copters. Next slide, please, David. You can see there, Phantom copter mystery has police baffled. Hundreds of these so-called phantom helicopters were seen, flying low over the moors and between narrow valleys, all hours of day or night. Many things were suggested, that there were drug runners, that there were IRA arms smugglers and so on and so forth. And eventually, it came to pass after the Berwyn events that people decided that they were searching for this UFO which was due to crash. Second slide, please, David. You will see there that there's another selection of cuttings, and the top right-hand cutting, that helicopter may just be illusion, is probably the secret to these cases, because no actual helicopter was ever filmed, tracked down to its lair or anything, and it really was an outbreak of misperception. People were misperceiving aircraft lights, stars, planets, and all manner of strange things as helicopters. This was hyped up by the press who were involved in a campaign against the IRA at the time. But this is one of the things that got attracted and attached to the Berwyn case. If you read more about it in, say, Nick Redfern's books, you'll see where this all arose from. Wednesday the 23rd of January 1974 was just another winter's day in Bala and the nearby villages of Llandrithlo and Llandafell. The weather was cold and wet with patches of snow which still clung to the nearby Berwyn Mountains. UFOs were the last thing on the minds of the villagers that day, but as darkness closed in, a series of events took place that was to change all that, and which had far-reaching effects which are still being discussed in the area over 36 years later. Shortly after 8:30 p.m, people in the area were jolted from their evening activities by a huge rumbling noise lasting 4 or 5 seconds. This was followed immediately by the sound of a huge explosion. Furniture moved, ornaments and pictures fell from walls and shelves, buildings shook, and livestock voiced their terror into the night. Thousands, literally thousands of terrified people shot to their windows and to the doors to scan the night skies before flooding into the streets of Llandrithlo and Llandafell in an attempt to discover the cause of the disturbance. Many of those jolted into activity recall seeing a huge white and green light streaking across the heavens immediately after the explosion. Others saw a brilliant flash of light, and some said a fire could be seen on the mountain. And as the lights died away, looking across the mountains, they could see bright fingers of light probing vertically into the starry sky. You put the next slide on, David. In the village of Llandrithlo, Drinkers flooded from the local pub, the Dudley Arms, and out into the streets. Literally hundreds of people phoned the police and other emergency services from, next slide, from this phone box, which was probably the most famous phone box in Wales in 1974. One of those who used the phone box was the local village policeman, P.C. Owen. His call was received by Colwyn Bay Police HQ at 9 p.m, and this is a verbatim extract from what he said. Quote, "There was a terrific explosion, I heard it, there's a flashing light up on Cader Bronwyn, it could be a crashed aircraft." By then the beams of light had disappeared, and Owen left the phone box and went back to the pub. A few days after the event, he was interviewed by some seismologists. Next slide, please. And these are the notes made by the seismologists. Unfortunately, you can't easily read them there, but you can see, if you read it close up, that he was of the opinion an airplane had crashed. In fact, the majority of people in the area also believed that the noise and lights had been caused by a plane crash. And as you'll soon see, it was this belief which led to someone witnessing the anomaly which lies at the heart of the Berwyn events. Hundreds of other people in Landreth Lowlander Fell had similar experiences to that of P.C. Owen, and there are many other accounts that I list in the book. So, to start with, what caused the terrible noise and rumbling felt by thousands? What caused the almost simultaneous lights seen overhead? Well, numerous people, if you read the books and look at the internet, look under Berwyn UFO on Google, numerous people believe that what was seen was a UFO coming to Earth, and the noise was the UFO crashing. And I'm afraid that's not the case at all, appealing though it seems. The noise was an earth tremor, and the flash of light and the lights in the sky seen by P.C. Owen and others was a bow-lined meteor. And of course that's easy for me to say, but I believe there is more than enough evidence to prove both assertions. So, firstly, the earthquake. At 8:39 p.m, seismographs in several locations recorded an earthquake of magnitude of 4 mLs. Next slide, Dave. This is the example from the seismograph of the 23rd of January taken at Estilmuir Observatory. You can see the peak on the graph there. And if you run the next DVD, please.
The British Geological Survey's observatory had measured a quake with a magnitude of 3.5 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was just a mile from Llandrillo. The earth tremor explained the shaking ground and could also have been responsible for the explosive sound.
So that was the official view of the British Geological Society, who at the time were known as the International Geological Society. Many witnesses heard not only a rumbling, but an actual explosion, as if something had hit the ground hard. That too was an effect of the earthquake, and here's Roger Mussum of the British Geological Society to explain a little more about how earthquakes are perceived by humans. David?
In all British earthquakes, often people say that the sound was more terrible than the shaking. What happens is that when these shockwaves reach the surface of the Earth, a certain amount of them change from being shockwaves travelling through the ground to shockwaves travelling through the air as sound. So what you get is a booming sound or a rumbling sound. These are very widely reported.
So, far from being a localised impact, as it would have been the case if a plane or even a UFO crashed, the earth tremor was felt as far south as the Barmouth area. Next slide, please. As far south as Barmouth, which is about there, as far north as Liverpool, out into the West Midlands, and out into the Anglesey coastline. Had it genuinely been an aircraft impact or even a UFO impact, whatever a UFO is, it wouldn't have been felt as far away. Several studies have been carried out into the Berwyn earthquake, and 3 separate locations have been suggested as to its epicentre. Next slide, please, David. You can see 3 locations there, just outside whatever village that is. That's an interesting location we'll come to in a minute, and another one there. Next slide, David, please. One of the locations where it was the epicentre was suggested was directly under this cairn circle called Moel Tir Uchaf, which is on the slopes of Cader Bronwyn, and we'll return to that later. It's one of a couple of interesting anomalies connected to the quake. A few days after the Berwyn events, a team of scientists investigating prehistoric sites were taking radiation readings at this circle and found higher than background levels of radiation. Is that a coincidence? I think so, but just one of the many which attend the Berwyn case, loose ends which have yet to be resolved and which may either be clues or red herrings. Science, I believe, has conclusively proved that the rumbling and explosions felt at 8:39 was an earthquake, but what are the flashes of light seen on the mountains by PCO and others? And what are the lights seen streaking overhead at the same time as what we now know is the earthquake? Unfortunately, this was in a very remote area where few people had cameras, it was pre-digital photography, and no one took any photographs. But there are numerous descriptions. One of the best by far is that of Annie Williams. Next slide, please. Mrs. Annie Williams and Mrs. Elizabeth Hughes described what they were experienced as being, quote, like something out of Doctor Who. On feeling the tremor, they rushed from their bungalow at Broadinham. Mrs. Williams later telling The Guardian, quote, I saw this bright light coming in the sky. It had a long fiery tail which seemed to be sparking off small stars. It seemed to be motionless for several minutes, going dim and then very brilliant, like a dormant fire, which keeps coming back to life. It would have been like an electric bulb in shape, except it seemed to have rough edges, then fell somewhere behind the hills at the back of my bungalow, and the earth shook. Sounds quite dramatic. But it doesn't really sound much like a UFO or flying saucer. It does, however, sound very much like a bow-legged meteor. These are spectacular natural phenomena, and even the lesser ones are magnificent visual spectacles. The one seen over the Berwyns on the 23rd of January 1974 was an outstanding example of this phenomenon. Imagine the experience of hearing a terrible rumbling and explosion followed within a few seconds by the sight of a bow-legged meteor, which might have looked something like this. Next DVD. And this is a film of one taken in America. And as you can see, it's green with flashes on, it's huge, it's dramatic, bits fall off it, and it eventually just trails away. If you couple that with people rushing out of the doors after feeling the earth shake and hearing a tremendous explosion, you can see why they connected the two things together. Is it any surprise that witnesses thought a plane was in trouble and had crashed? Yes, you're possibly thinking. But what about the flashes of light seen by numerous witnesses? Well, these bow-legged meteors, as they disintegrate, can appear as a flash and can literally light up the night as though it were day. If you run the next DVD. There's another one from America. It's dark, and suddenly it's as light as day, and that's caused by a bow-legged meteor exploding. And it can literally light up the landscape as though it was midday. But don't you think it's just too much of a coincidence to have a huge earthquake and a spectacular meteor within a few seconds of each other? Lots of people do, and that's why people think it's a UFO. But really, the multiverse is a really wonderful place, and time is long. And in reality, we know that quakes exist, and we also know meteors exist, and it really would be even odder if occasionally the two don't combine together to put on a spectacular show of sonne lumiere just for us. The Fortean philosopher Charles Fort, next slide please, there he is, there's Charles, writing in his book New Lands, recorded several instances of earthquakes accompanying bow-legged meteors. And if the idea that a simultaneous earthquake and meteor could lead people to believe a UFO had crashed, then an event from October 1661 might put things in perspective. Following an earthquake and sightings of a, quote, monstrous flaming things in the sky, and Mrs. Margaret Petmore reputedly went into labour and, quote, brought forth 3 male offspring, all of whom had teeth and spoke at birth. Did that really happen? Well, it was reported as having done so in the press, just like the Berwyn Mountain event. And as with the Berwyn Mountain UFO legend, there is no evidence other than rumour in support of the claim. UFOs and aliens were not part of the 17th century's catalogue of wonders, but freakish births were. Each age, it seems, interprets the unknown in a way that is culturally acceptable. Perhaps the most dramatic case of an earthquake, accompanied by a meteor, comes from 1896. On 17th of December of that year, at 5:30 AM, a large meteor passed over the Hereford and Worcestershire area. It was bright enough to illuminate the landscape, exactly as we've seen, and at exactly the same time, an earthquake took place. No talking babies, or UFOs for that matter, were recorded, but at least one person is reported as dying from shock. Next slide, please. That's just a thought that he had. Borderline meteors crop up later in our story, but for now we must move on to some events which are even stranger than the lights and noise, and which form the central part of the Berwyn Mountains UFO mystery. At the time of the events, the locals in the area of the Berwyn Mountains had no idea that the combination of an earthquake and meteor was responsible. The majority believed an aircraft had crashed. One of those people, desperately trying to get through to the police, was Nurse Pat Evans from the nearby village of Llanderfell. Slide. It just shows where Llanderfell is in relation to the Berwyn Mountains there, just about 5 miles away. Pat Evans occupies a central role in the Berwyn Mountain UFO case, and if any part of the events can be said to be and to remain unexplained, it is the experience she had that night. The story of what happens to Pat Evans that night is complicated and has been persistently misinterpreted by several UFO writers. What I'm about to tell you is actually what happened to her, not what people wish had happened to her. Initially, Pat tried for a long time to get through to the emergency services, and she eventually got through to the police in Colwyn Bay. Some ufologists, if you read the literature, have claimed that it was the police who suggested that Pat drove onto the mountain to see if there was a plane crash, but in fact it was Pat herself who offered to go. She suggested to the police that an aircraft might have crashed, and as a trained nurse, she wanted to offer any help she could before the emergency services arrived. Pat told the police she was going to drive up the B4391 mountain road. So, loading her 2 small daughters into her car, she set off onto the mountain road on that miserable winter's night, a night that would change her life forever. And here's where the case I previously thought easily explained by earthquake and meteors gets very complicated indeed. Setting off, Pat drove from Llanderfell and drove towards the Berwyn Mountains. If we go to the next, we're on the next slide there. We'll just go back a slide, please. Right, what she did, she drove from there, and she drove down to there, up that road there, and on that road there. Next slide. And in daylight, this is what she would have, the view she would have seen on the top of the road. That's the B4391, there's the Berwyn Mountains stretching as far as there, which is kind of Bronwyn. She drove quickly, because the roads were quiet and she thought there was an emergency. She took the shortcut from the Brintillion Arms and came out to the B4391. The night was pitch black, with no moon or stars visible. Some drizzle was falling, but the outline of the mountains was clear. Had it been daylight, that's the view she would have seen. Pat was keen to get to the site of what she believed was an air disaster. As she drove, she scanned the mountains ahead for any signs of light. Once on the summit of the deserted mountain road, she halted, astonished at what she could see before her, because there, high on the barren mountainside, was a huge glowing ball of light. Next slide, please. That's obviously an artist's representation, but what she saw was pretty odd by anyone's standards. She was looking across a huge area of dark moorland and saw light that she described as just being slightly less large than the full moon, actually on the mountainside, not in the air. Whatever the object was, it was too far from the road to be reached on foot. She and her daughters watched, flabbergasted, as the ball of light slowly pulsated, changing colour from red to yellow to white and back again. It was strange. There were no flames, and whatever it was didn't look like what she expected an air disaster to resemble. The nurse and her daughters could only stare, mystified at the scene before them. As she viewed this astonishing sight, the nurse could see other lights near it. Some were small, like torches, and others were like those of a vehicle. They were moving around and towards the huge light on the hillside. We know a great deal about Pat Evans' sighting because she was interviewed a few days later by seismologists, an interview which produced 2 pages of notes. I tracked this document down at the BGS in Edinburgh and was amazed at its contents. Next slide, please. Oh.
Nurse Evans gave a statement to the British Geological Survey in 1974, which only came to light in the 1980s.
And the next slide, please. You can't see it, unfortunately, in this slide, but basically there are 2 pages of notes where the BGS interviewers got Pat to draw, or drew for her, what she saw, and she drew a circle, which you can barely see there, with another circle inside it. Go to the next slide, please. No, it's not coming out well at all. And she drew the lights moving towards it. It tells us a great deal. The vehicle and torchlights moving towards the light, the size and colour of the light, and her quote, note that whatever and wherever the object or light was, it was just to the right of the Corwin lights. Now this is important because this shows where she was looking. If we go to the next slide, this is a map annotated by the British Geological Society investigators. Everyone they interviewed after the events was given a number and a location. Pat was there, C100, which is not coming out particularly clearly here, and she was looking across, and she said in her notes at the time that whatever she saw was just to the right of the Corwin lights. Corwin and Cunwood are there and there. This area is mountain, so anything she saw just to the right of them was around that area there. C14, I think, which will become important soon. And again, this might sound confusing, and obviously that's why I wrote the book, to clarify it all, so you'll get more clarification there. We also know exactly what time Pat set off, which is crucial, and this means we can determine with some certainty what time she was on the mountain road looking at the anomalous light. Pat's sighting is the central mystery of the Berwyn Mountain UFO case, but it is fraught with problems, as I'll attempt to explain. Firstly, there's the problem of exactly where the unusual light was. When she was interviewed by the seismologists, they only recorded where Pat was, which was point C100 there. They did this by marking her location in the master map, which you've seen. Pat's location was marked, and Pat agreed this location was correct, and I interviewed her in early 1988. If you look closely at the map, you can see the interviewers drawn a line, which you can't, unfortunately, but on the map there is a very thin pencil line that goes across there to point C64, and Pat believes that is where she was looking to, point C64. We know to within a few minutes what time Pat Evans was observing the light, and we know she probably saw it in one of two locations, which was there. She drove about half a mile or so to the county boundary as she watched it and returned to the same spot. So she was driving from there to about there and back again, and all the time she could see the huge light across on the hillside. This is all very steep hillside, so if it was in one of the folds of landscape there under the peak, she couldn't have seen it at all. It had to be somewhere around there, by her own admission in 1974. Whatever it was, she was baffled, and she was unable to identify it or to reach it, so she realised that it was too far away to be of any practical assistance, and she set off for home, believing that the lights that she'd seen near it were the emergency services. She set off down the mountain road. Now again, if you read the literature on the internet or in other ufologists' books, some ufologists have claimed that on the journey back down the mountain road to her village, she saw vehicles ahead of her on the road and was surprised to be flagged down and stopped by a group of police and soldiers. They were clearly unhappy at seeing her there and forcefully ordered her off the mountain, telling her that the road was now cordoned off and all members of the public were banned from it. And this has become part of the Berwyn Mountain UFO legend, that Pat was ordered off the mountain by the police and military, and that the mountain was sealed off several days after. This is complete nonsense, and it really stems from an interview that Pat Evans gave to a ufologist called Margaret Fry in 1985. Unfortunately, Margaret didn't take the interview and went on what she believed Pat had told her, and she believed that Pat had told her she'd been stopped. And this piece of misinformation was picked up by another ufologist called Jenny Randalls, which was repeated then widely in a number of books and magazines, not least this one. Next slide, please. UFO Retrievals. Any ufologists in the audience will know this was a sort of a seminal book about UFO crashes from 1995. And it was this book which really brought the Berwyn events into the public eye. And Jenny's claim that Pat had been stopped by police and military cemented the idea that there was a cover-up of something, that something being the military retrieval of a downed UFO. Next slide. This is a quote from the book. Police and military forces who had been even closer to the object passed her on the way down the mountain. She explained why she was there and asked what was happening. Next slide. Nobody answered her questions except to say she would have to leave. No one unauthorised was allowed up there, so they escorted her down to the main road. Because she was afraid for her daughter's safety, she did not argue and left. Complete and absolute nonsense. That never happened. Of course, I could be just saying that, but I've got that from Pat's own mouth. I interviewed Pat on tape in early 1998, and she stated unequivocally that, next slide, Not a living soul. I didn't see a soldier or policeman. I saw no one. And this is Pat on the B4391 in early 1998. She kindly drove me up there. And she's pointing to where she saw this huge red light across there. Now you can, anyone interested in it, and there are many ufologists who would be, can identify this exact spot by driving on the 4391 and finding this gully that runs down. If you follow Pat's line of sight, it runs right over to more or less point C64 on the British Geological Survey map. The whole Pat Evans situation is confusing, but it is the central mystery in the Berwyn event, because what could she have seen and why didn't anyone else see it? The simple answer is that I don't know, but there are perhaps some clues. At the same time that Pat Evans was phoning the police and contemplating travelling up the mountain road, two other groups of people were becoming involved in the night's events. Immediately after the earth tremor, at 8:39, Inspector Glyn Evans, based at Dolgethly police station, some 20 miles away, set off at speed to the Bala area. He stopped at Bala police station and discussed the situation with Police Sergeant Elford Roberts. They set off for Llandrithlo in the Bala police van. When they reached Llandrithlo at about 9:20 p.m, they found the village in an uproar, with puzzled villagers thronging the streets trying to understand what had taken place. After conferring with PC Owen, the village policemen, Evans and Roberts, decided that they needed to take a close look on the mountain themselves, but as neither had the local knowledge or a suitable vehicle, they decided to commandeer one. And here's where the story of Pat Evans possibly intertwines with that of the police and several other characters. What follows is just an overview of this complex part of the case, which, because it is the core of the Berwyn events, occupies 2 chapters in my book. Next slide, please. This is a general view of the area. You can see the village of Llandrithlo there, and the 2 policemen went up this road here. Next slide, please. And we're back here. So basically, from Llandrithlo, the 2 policemen drove up this road, which is the council road, which turns into a forestry track. They stopped more or less at the end of the council road before the forestry track, and they stopped at a farm called Garthian. At Garthian, 14-year-old Hugh Thomas was watching TV with his elderly neighbour Enoch. He answered the door to the police and agreed to drive them up onto the mountainside in his Land Rover. There may have been 1 or 2 Land Rovers, but certainly he took the police up there. They drove up the tarmac road, and as they drove up, they got to a point about there, just before it ended, and they had to stop for a few moments because a car was blocking the road. A bit strange finding a car there at that time of night. This car and its occupants are crucial to understanding some of the lights seen immediately after the quake and bolide meteor. The car belonged to local poachers. The police knew this because they recognised the car, being a fairly close-knit area. The poachers, having seen the police officers they didn't know, were hiding behind the wall. The significance here is that one of the poachers later came forward and told of how him and his colleagues had been out hunting with powerful lamps at the time of the earthquake. At the time of the earthquake itself, they were on the plateau above Llandrithlo, there, which there's a steep hillside there and then a plateau area, and that's where the earthquake happened. They were hunting snipe, and the beams of light seen by villagers in Llandrithlo were almost certainly the poachers' lamps as they flushed out hares and snipe. Having moved the poacher's car, the police and the farmer's son continued up the steep forestry road to the mountain gate, which is where the road runs out and comes onto the mountain there. Next slide, please. This is an overview. That's Garthian Farm there. The council road is there. The forestry track goes through there. The poachers were somewhere around there, and it comes out onto open mountainside there. These are the Berwyn Mountains. Pat Evans was on a road about there, looking across, I believe, to there. Next slide. This is the mountain gate that the police got to. Had it been light, this is the view they would have seen. They drove through the mountain gate and slowly out onto the mountain side, with some police officers walking alongside the vehicles with torches. The landscape at this point opens out to reveal the foothills of Cape Bronwyn, which you can see above, and it is into this area that the police went. Next slide, please. Once through the mountain gate, this is the area that they were in. Cape Bronwyn there, Berwyn there, and the B4391 would have been there somewhere. So let's try and make some sense of this now. We know that Pat Evans was on the mountain road just after 10 PM looking across the mountainside to a huge light towards which a vehicle and torchlights were moving. And what she saw was a vast, huge light just to the right of the Corwin lights. Next slide, please. So you've got Pat Evans there, you've got the police and farmer's son with the vehicles there. Now, to me, it's fairly inescapable that what Pat was seeing, the huge red light, was there. From Pat's location, she would have certainly been able to see straight across to where the police were searching the hillside. If what Pat saw was just to the right of the Corwin lights, it would place it more or less where the police and farmer's son were. Yet, they saw and heard nothing. They didn't have any lights with them other than torchlights. They certainly didn't see a huge big red light. Pat had only reported that she saw one set of vehicles and torchlights. If there had been any other torches or vehicles on the mountains, Pat would have seen them, yet she only saw one set. The natural conclusion is that what Pat saw was something connected to the police search. And the police stated that they did get out of the vehicles and walked alongside them for a while, just as Pat saw. Next video, please. And the next one.
When we were on top of the mountain, we actually used our own torches. And then there was a period when we said, right, let's put the torches out and let's just be still for a while and look around and listen. As much as we could, we tried to establish if there was anything at all unusual up there.
That's the police sergeant from Dalgety speaking there. So this seems to be exactly what Pat Evans was seeing from the road a few miles away. If it wasn't, then there were two separate lots of vehicles and people out in the mountains, and one of which had something to do with this huge round blob UFO thing that she saw. And neither Pat Evans nor the police and father's son saw the other. This would be much simpler if Pat Evans hadn't given contradictory statements as to where she believed the mysteriously huge light was. The first time Pat ever spoke to a ufologist was in 1995 when she spoke to Margaret Fry. She went up the B4391 then with Margaret, and Pat showed Margaret where she felt the huge light had been. Next slide. Yeah, Pat was there, the police and farmer's son were in that area there, but initially Pat believed that she saw the light there when she spoke to Margaret Fry in 1995. Yet in 1974 she'd drawn a line or indicated that it was there. So time had already eroded her memory of the situation, because there's Corwin and Cunwood. If what she saw was just to the right of the Corwin lights, much more likely to have been there than high up on the mountain there. Next slide, please. This location is completely different to the general direction she indicated to the seismologist a few days after the event. So could it be that in the intervening 21 years Pat's memory had faded? Or did Margaret draw it from memory afterwards and put it in the wrong location? Next slide. This is the drawing that Margaret Fry did after meeting with Pat Evans in 1995. You can see the road there, and she drew the huge object as being in that location, which isn't where she told the seismologist in 1974, which was more or less down there. So either Pat was confused, or she saw something that was much larger than she described to the seismologist, because if she's saying she saw that, that's something the size of at least a house, possibly bigger, glowing and pulsating red with lights approaching it. And why didn't anyone else see that? This is a complete mystery. Can we have the next slide, please? If we look at a 3D model of the landscape, which is more or less from Pat's vantage point, we can see that Pat was parked there, and she was looking across the landscape to point C64 where the farmer's son and the police were, which is quite visible. There's the intervisibility between those two spots. This is the location more or less where she told Margaret Fry in 1995 the UFO, or whatever it was, had landed. If it was there, that would have also been able to be seen by the police and farmer's son, yet they didn't see that. So something was going on whereby Pat was seeing something that no one else could see, and her daughter saw it as well. To further confuse matters, over the years Pat has said the mystery object was anything from 1 to 3 miles away from her vantage point on the road. But the facts are it was pitch black and she had no idea of landmarks or distances. All we have for certain is the fact that the vehicles and torchlights were close to the object. Pat was also expected to come across a crash of an aircraft, and it's entirely possible that her perceptions looking across miles of open mountainside at night, pitch black with no points of reference for size, enhanced a small light belonging to the police into a larger light. When I interviewed Pat in 1998, we drove up to the spot where she parked and she pointed to where the light had been. As far as I could ascertain then, and from subsequent visits, she was definitely pointing towards the area searched by the police and not to the area Margaret Fry believed had taken place. Next slide, please. That's Pat pointing from there, where I parked, with her, to that area there. The area she told Margaret Fry she saw the object in was somewhere up there. So it just shows that witness perceptions change over time. If any of you are seriously interested in this case and wish to test my theory, you can easily locate where she stood. On the following day, the 24th of January, the story hit the media, and some of you might be old enough to remember this. Next, and the next one.
Hello here. A remote area of North Wales was shaken by a mysterious explosion during the night, and no one yet knows why.
Over the next few days after the event, all the major local, regional and national and TV companies covered the Berwyn events. But now, instead of the events being attributed to a plane crash, it was now decided a combination of earthquake and meteor was responsible. Next slide, please. That's a typical, I think that's from the Times, mystery of the thing in the night, where they're still not sure what it was, but they are at least referring to the fact a meteor and earthquake was involved. But neither of these things could be responsible for Pat Evans' experience. Earthquakes can produce lights, as researcher Paul Everett has demonstrated over the years, but they don't produce huge stationary lights that last for over 10 minutes. Meteors can fall to the Earth, in which case they are known as meteorites, but neither one of these appear to be so large at such a great distance for such a long time for Pat to have seen them. Had the Berwyn events taken place in the 1980s or 1990s, or even the first decade of this century, the media would have tagged it as a UFO case immediately. Irrespective of plausible explanations, as it was, only one newspaper mentioned UFOs, and this was the Daily Mail. Next slide, please. 2 days after the event, even then it was in the context of the industrial unrest which was causing coal shortages at the time, and that's the only mention of it being a possible UFO at the time, and that was in jest. But it didn't take long for rumours to start. A few days after the incident, a group of people were in the area carrying out a survey of the stone circle, which I mentioned earlier. Their instruments recorded unusually high radiation readings at the stones of Mola T. Ucaf, readings that could not be accounted for. Were these readings, they mused, connected in some way with the events which had taken place a few days earlier? The astute among you will recall that one of the locations for the earthquake's epicentre was directly under this stone circle. Next slide. There we go. A local newspaper was certain that the event involved a crash of some kind or other. Next slide. And it quoted, "There is a report that an army vehicle was seen coming down the mountain near Bala Lake with a large square box on the back and accompanied by outriders." This is classic ufological stuff, and yes, this report took place in the Borders and County Advertiser, but it wasn't attributed to anyone, and nor did any other witnesses come forward to substantiate the claim. But this anecdote has been seized on by some ufologists as implying something did crash and was retrieved. But it's completely fraught with problems because no one saw anything crash for a start. People were on the mountain searching it until at least 11 o'clock and again at 7 a.m. in the morning. No one saw a military crash retrieval team arrive, depart, or be in the process of doing anything. It would have been impossible for such an event to take place without witnesses, although there is the slightest possibility. Although there's the slightest possibility that this is exactly what Pat Evans saw taking place at a distance. And once again, ufologists came to the rescue by claiming that roads and vast areas of mountainside were cordoned off, allowing the military to retrieve whatever had crashed. But this is just pure fantasy. Some local people were unhappy that the authorities refused to acknowledge that anything unusual had taken place at all. The police claimed they could not find any cause for the mystery noise and lights and categorically stated there had been no crash. Scientists and knowledgeable members of the public suggested meteors and earth tremors were responsible for the noise and lights, but some people didn't believe them. The media soon forgot about the incident, and locals too let the matter slip deep from their memories. But UFO researchers that realised that something had occurred that had not been satisfactorily explained, lights in the sky, mysterious explosions coupled with unusual military activity are avidly noted by the UFO community as indicators of a UFO crash, and various UFO journals reported the events. But within a year of the event, UFO investigators began to receive official-looking documents from a top-secret group called Aerial Phenomena Inquiry Network, or APEN. These papers made the staggering claim that an extraterrestrial craft had come down in the Berwyn Mountains and had been retrieved for study. They also claimed that key witnesses to the UFO crash had been recommended for hypnotic regression. The APEN documents led to greater interest in the event, and by the late 70s, Britain's most famous UFO researcher, Jenny Randalls, was claiming that a crash had taken place. And this was accentuated because she was at a talk at RAF Shawbury in 1984, and when she mentioned the subject, she said there was an awkward silence from senior personnel, implying that something happened, and she believed that a nuclear reactor had dropped off an aeroplane. Other events happened where a soldier came out of the woodwork and claimed that he'd been part of the UFO crash retrieval team, but this again was completely refuted because no one could prove who this soldier was. Some have claimed that the Berwyn Mountain events were Britain's equivalent to the infamous Roswell crash of 1947, and that they were going to prove finally that a UFO had been removed by the military. They had the anecdotal evidence and the information. All they needed now was the physical evidence. But it seemed every angle of research was closed off for them. The Ministry of Defence denied having a file on the incident, and police records from 1974 had long been destroyed. But the reasons why there were no records was the MOD didn't have the file because it wasn't reported to them as a UFO. It was made a UFO case by ufologists. I'm skimming a little bit here. The whole case has been a mishmash from start to finish. I initially thought it was all solved. I now think it's mostly solved, but not totally solved. The legend of the Berwyn Mountain UFO is more alive today than ever before. Some people believe it was the crash and retrieval of an alien spaceship, others that it was just a legend which grew from a complicated series of events involving an earthquake coupled with a particularly bright meteor shower. As I've noted, neither of these options explains all elements of the case, especially the Pat Evans sighting of a huge stationary ball of light in the mountainside for a long time. I was convinced that Pat had seen a poacher's lamp, placed stationary on the floor when the police met the poachers on the mountain, but recent research has shown that the poachers only met the police later and further down the valley. I've only scratched the surface of the Berwyn Mountain case in my talk tonight and concentrated quickly on the main points, and obviously I recommend you buy the book to read a fuller, in-depth look at it. But if something unusual did happen on that winter's night 36 years ago, the key to it lies in Pat Evans' sighting. She's as mystified now as she was then, and I'd like to leave you with a quote from Pat. Next slide. Oh, next slide, sorry. And the next one. This is what her final words on the subject are, but I kept thinking we'd be told, and the mystery deepens because you're not told. That's been a very hurried rush through the Berwyn case. Thank you very much.
Andy, I always feel guilty when you're trying to talk. Yeah, we are all guilty. It's hippie guilt versus Catholic. But I always feel guilty when someone like you is giving a talk and we've got us bustling around behind you. Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions. Oh dear. Okay, Andy, can we deal with Ronan asking a question? No, let's ask. Can I have a run at these? Really? By the way, for those of you who don't know, Greg is my godson. He gets his boyish good looks from his old godfather. Quiet. Turned on.
The report by Margaret Fry, I seem to remember hearing that she was somewhat of advancing years and disabled. Was she sort of so far gone that she could have distorted very easily what Nurse Evans did?
I don't think it was necessarily that. I think what it was is Margaret just didn't tape interviews, and it was just a misreading of what she was actually told. I think because Margaret is a fervent ETH believer, that she wanted to believe Pat had been stopped on the mountains, misheard her saying, I was not stopped or talked to by anyone, and that story then just got out. And obviously, ufologists are going to believe it when people say someone was ordered off the mountains by the military rather than that they weren't. So a natural error is, see, this is why people should always tape interviews, because then you've got the proof of what someone actually said. So I don't think it was malicious or to do with advancing agents. I think it was a genuine mistake.
Just one other question. A lot of people use the expression UFO when they're talking to me. Does that mean they think I'm an alien?
It could possibly be. I believe there's proof somewhere. Yes. So deep inside Whitehall, I think, Ronan.
I see. Right, thank you.
Okay, Nick in the front row.
Hello. Having read some UFO investigation books, one written by a chap who employed a lot of hypnotic regression, do you perhaps think there could have been an issue of wishful thinking on the part of the witness who reported the light phenomenon?
No, I don't, because Pat Evans initially mentioned it to the British Geological Survey 2 or 3 days after the event. Not in the context of a UFO or anything, just in the context of what she saw. UFOs weren't even in the picture then. It didn't become a UFO case until Margaret Fry took it up in the up until Margaret Fry re-interviewed Pat in the 1990s. So I think Pat Evans genuinely reported what she saw, but I don't think that what she saw was as big or dramatic as she believed it to have been. I think it's a matter of perception. You've got to be very careful there, because I don't want to appear that I'm dissing the witness, because I'm not in any way. And I feel quite sorry for Pat that, because of her altruistic aims and genuinely trying to offer help to what she believed was an air crash, she's become embroiled in the stupid ufological claim and counterclaim where people are basically tearing her what she said or didn't say apart. And I can't say I'd be very happy when she receives a copy of my book.
Okay, one more. We've got time for one more. I can't see. Oh, we've got 2 more. 3 more. Oh, hell, it's the first night.
Just got one question. What's your belief in this?
In this particular thing? Well, as I said originally, I thought that everything was solved by a combination of earthquake, bolide meteors, coupled with rumour, and that what Pat had seen was the police and farmer's son and meeting with the poachers, and the poachers, I don't know if you know anything about poachers' lamps, but they use car batteries with headlamps mounted on them. And I originally thought that the police had met the poachers had put their lamp on the floor, this was shining across the valley, and Pat was seeing it refracted through light drizzle, and it was appearing to be a large pulsating light. I now know that the police, that they didn't meet the poachers, and that didn't happen, so therefore I now do not know what that was, and I can't even speculate, because I can only go on what I know, which is, I know bugger all, quite frankly. So she had an anomalous experience, whether that can be resolved, I don't know. We need those people to come forward who are in possession of that light.
But what's your belief in this? What do you believe?
Well, that's what I believe. I believe she had an anomalous experience which I cannot explain. There's no point in me believing it was X, Y or Z because there is no evidence for X, Y or Z. There is just the experience which is unresolved, and as a 40-year I would be a disgrace to my profession, if you like, if I started imposing belief on other people's sightings without backup evidence.